Alright, hello everybody. So welcome to our lesson on a new century, segregation and discrimination. So our objectives and standards to recognize discrimination and segregation against African Americans and identify the mistreatment of Mexican Americans as well as other groups too. We'll talk about the Chinese Americans as well. Please take a look at the standards. Alright, so some vocabulary here for you. Poll tax, an annual tax required to be paid before qualifying to vote. The grandfather clause, this allowed white males to vote if their father or grandfather had been eligible to vote before January 1st, 1867, if the voter had failed the literacy test, or could not pay the poll tax. Segregation, which is the separation of different races by law. Jim Crow laws, which is the nickname for segregation laws in southern states, and debt peonage system that bound laborers into slavery for work until they were able to pay off the debt to the employer. And our central question, how were different groups treated at the beginning of the 1900s? Alright, so let's talk about Reconstruction. African Americans began to use their new political and social rights during Reconstruction. However, they often faced violent and hostile opposition from whites. There were new laws that restricted African American rights that soon appeared. But African Americans continued to vote, and some held political office. However, by the end of the 1800s, racial discrimination prevented African Americans from their rights. So the right to vote restricted. Southern states put in place voting restrictions and denied legal equality for African Americans. Excuse me. Literacy tests were administered, meaning to see if you could read and write, in some states, and those who could not read were not allowed to vote. African Americans were frequently asked more difficult questions than whites, or given a test in another language, and officials passed or failed individuals as they pleased. Now, another way to restrict voting rights was through poll taxes, and many African Americans and white sharecroppers were too poor to pay these. However, whites could be exempt through the grandfather clause, which we talked about, which if your father or grandfather was able to vote before January 1st, 1867, you would be exempt from these laws. So African Americans, these laws always applied to them, but whites could be exempted from them. Now, the Supreme Court was unable to overturn the restrictions on African American voting rights in the 1870s and 1880s. Southern states were then able to pass segregation laws that separated whites and African Americans in public and private facilities. And these came to be known as Jim Crow laws from a song of the time period. African Americans and whites were separated in schools, hospitals, parks, and transportation systems. Now, a case eventually did reach the Supreme Court to challenge segregation. In 1896, the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that the separation of races was legal as long as it did not violate the 14th Amendment. So what this became known as is separate but equal doctrine. So again, just to kind of summarize it easier, Southern states could keep segregated facilities as long as they were equal. So as long as they provided African Americans a bathroom or a water fountain, as long as they provided them that, it was legal. Okay, so they needed to provide them, something, and as long as they did that, it was still considered legal. It could be in a worse condition, and many times they were, but as long as they had a bathroom or a school or a hospital, it was legal for the southern states to do this. Now, African Americans not only faced legal rules, they also faced informal rules, and these were known as racial etiquette. Customs of these racial etiquette were used frequently to embarrass African Americans or belittle them. For example, whites and African Americans were not to shake hands because that would symbolize equality or them being equal, so they were not allowed to shake hands. And African American men were to remove their hats for whites, and African Americans were to yield or move off the sidewalk to allow white pedestrians to walk. So again, a lot of these things were kind of used to embarrass African Americans to make them kind of, I guess, bow down to whites. Now, African Americans who did not follow racial etiquette could face death or violence. Many were accused of violating racial etiquette and were lynched. So more than 1,400 African American men and women were shot, burned, or hanged between 1882 and 1892 without a trial in the South. Now, lynchings peaked in the 1880s and 1890s, but lynchings will continue well into the 20th century. We talked about this a little bit already in our live class, but by 1900, many African Americans had moved to northern cities. They moved there for better paying jobs and social equality. But after their arrival in northern cities, they realized that they faced discrimination in the north as well. African Americans frequently lived in segregated neighborhoods, and they faced discrimination in terms of jobs. And African Americans were also the last ones to be hired, and they were the first to be fired. So they were the last ones to be hired for any type of job, but once they were hired for a job, they could be the first ones fired before white people. And violence finally broke out between whites and African Americans during the New York City race riot of 1900, after an African American man killed a white police officer who the man believed the white police officer had mistreated the man's wife. So race riots broke out then in 1900. So let's talk about the West. There were many different groups in the Western states, including Native Americans, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Asian Americans. Now, Mexican Americans were hired over any other ethnic group at the end of the 1800s to work the railroad in the Southwest, and the 1902 National Reclamation Act gave government assistance for irrigation projects, which would help southwestern areas. Mexican laborers became the major workforce for this. However, many African Americans and Mexican Americans found themselves forced into debt peonage, which means they would have to work off their labor from their employer. So kind of like slavery. And there was also discrimination against the Chinese. We talked about this already a little bit when we talked about immigration in our other classes, but more than 100,000 Chinese immigrants lived in the U.S. by 1880. The fear of whites over Chinese immigrants taking their jobs pushed many Chinese into segregated schools and neighborhoods. And there was also strong opposition to Chinese immigrants across the country. And like I said, we saw this with an example of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded Chinese immigrants for many, many years to our country. All right, everyone, so we'll wrap up a new century of segregation and discrimination. So African Americans face segregation and discrimination in the South and the North. And we also talked about many other groups, including Mexican Americans and Chinese Americans, facing discrimination and segregation across the country and in the Southwest as well. All right, so that's all I have for this lesson. So please just complete the questions. Let me know if you have any concerns, and I'll see and talk to you later.